Please be seated. It was in second or third grade that a new family moved across the street from where I grew up in Northern California. He was a shy boy. He went to my school, so it took a while to get to know him, and he would tell the most fantastic stories of where he had just moved from, an island in the deep Pacific, South Pacific, and he would talk about walking in the mornings and walking by the sugarcane fields and picking a sugarcane and tasting it, and it just sounded so fantastic. And it was only later that it turned out that his family had been part of a religious cult, and that they had then left it and moved to Northern California. And the family, I got to know his parents sort of well, but they kept to themselves, and it wasn't a surprise as I thought about them. I think partly some shame. How do you explain that we had grown up in a religious cult? But honestly, and I don't mean this as a joke, but in Northern California, lots of people come from lots of backgrounds, and so I don't think it was really shame that made them come to themselves. And when I was older, I saw some pictures of them on that island and even a video that they had filmed, and I could see they were so young, and you could see in their faces of his parents, my friend's parents, just this joy, this feeling of profound meaning and purpose. And I think the reason they kept to themselves was it was too hard to explain. How could you explain to people who hadn't experienced it what it was like to be captured by a religious leader, to feel so moved by this teaching that you would take your family and move halfway across the world, that you would live there for years in deep community, forgetting about the outside world, building the new Jerusalem here on earth? How could you explain that to people? And then how could you explain the disillusionment that must have happened when you found out that maybe this leader was not all that he was cracked up to be? And then you had to break away from these people who had become your family and your friends, and then to move back to California. How could you explain that? And so it makes sense to me that they kept to themselves. And there is a phenomenon that sociologists call hide and die, that when we experience a kind of deep trauma or shame or disillusionment or dislocation, that our feeling is to break away, go into a corner or far off and hide and cover ourselves. And this happens even in things where groups get lost in the wilderness and huddled together in the snow. They are safe and warm, but then someone will feel it's just too much. I can't be here. And they'll rip off their clothes and run off and go away, trying to escape this, hiding and dying. Or people who've experienced war and they come back to their families and they have a wall up, or something like 9/11, surviving that, hiding and dying. And so it's surprising to me that the disciples here in John 21, the story, are still together. You know, in John 20, a chapter before, you could understand, in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' crucifixion, the end of their time together, all their hope, that they would be together, and that Jesus then appeared. But months later, maybe years later, all the way in a different place, not in Jerusalem, but all the way up in Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, why are they still together? Haven't they gone back to their old lives? Don't they feel inside a part of them some shame or disappointment at least? Or, yes, that was an amazing run that we had together, but now I'm going to go back to my old life. But they didn't. They stayed together. Peter said, I'm going fishing. And the 6 of the others said, we're going to come with you. Something kept them together. And then when they were together, what happened? Then they had this profound encounter with the risen Lord. I used to think it worked the other way, that the disciples met Jesus and then they founded the church, became this community. But I'm realizing now that I think it's different. I think they made a commitment to stay together. They decided we are not going to go hide and die. That in my disappointment, confusion, this location, in the months after following Jesus for years of my life and giving up everything, and nothing seemingly changed, they made a commitment that we would still be together. And then in being together, in being a community, an early form of church, then they encountered the risen Jesus. And it wasn't just some religious high, the effect of that encounter. What happened? They encountered Jesus. And then these simple fishermen did unbelievably heroic things. Peter himself and most of the disciples were martyred for their faith. They found inside, first in committing to be together and then encountering Jesus, they found a power inside themselves they didn't realize they had to go and to witness to the faith, even to their death. So I was in my mid-20s when I had my own hide and die moment. I had gone off to a famous college on the East Coast and done well and had a job in investment banking, and I was on track, as I should have been, to make my immigrant parents proud. But inside I was having a crisis. Nothing seemed to make sense. I was feeling depressed. I couldn't do anything. I left my job and I came back home to my family. And my friend, he was living there, but for him, this was sort of part of his life. He was a painter and artist, and so he was always going to be with his parents. And he had heard that Stephen, who my whole community had this faith that he was going to go off and do these great things. Something has happened to him, and he's just at home. He doesn't want to see anybody. He can't seem to get off the couch. And so he would come and knock on the door. And because he was my oldest friend, I couldn't really, unlike everyone else, shut him out. And he would say, come on, let's go for a hike. I'm going to do a painting in the woods. Come on, I have a great hike. Let's just go. And that's all his agenda was. It wasn't, hey, maybe you should go to therapy, or have you tried some antidepressants, or what's wrong? You had everything in your favor. What is wrong? Nothing. He just said, I have to do some painting in the woods. Let's go take a hike. Now, we did this for months. Nothing in my life really changed. But that was the low in retrospect. And slowly, somehow, things did change and get better, and I found my way back to the path. But if my friend, who is not a Christian and not really religious in a Western sense, if my friend could be the living Jesus Christ to me, a person who thought, I don't need any of that, I'm self-sufficient, I'm smart enough, I'm going to achieve all this on my own. So if this most unlikely evangelist could be Jesus Christ to me, a person who was most unlikely, seemingly, to need it, then when we show up together here on Sunday, that is what we can be for each other. I know some of the stories in this room. I know what you're bringing. I know the grief of the death, or the sickness you're bearing, or the family problems, or the worries about your job. And yet we have decided to come together, to show up for one another. And as we do this, our faith teaches us, and our personal experience will show us that we will encounter the risen Christ. And in that encounter, our lives will be so transformed that we can do more than we can ever ask or imagine.